All right. I did say in yesterday's Montreal Canadiens Kent Hughes questioning video that the entire conversation we'd have about the Canadiens today would be different. I apologize for changing everything up on you last second. And I also apologize for making 2 straight Vancouver Canucks related videos. That's not good for the algorithm, but if you did not see our post-game review of the Canucks and the Blackhawks from last night, that is available on YouTube as well. However, when I saw this article pop up in my timeline yesterday, I was like, okay, we need to talk about that as quickly as possible. So today, what we're doing is we're heading over to Frank Seravalli's assessment of Canadiens forward Sean Monahan, and, in Seravalli's opinion, why Sean Monahan is worth the risk as a trade deadline acquisition. Now, Monahan, of course, has been talked about in a trade capacity for most of the year. I think a lot of Canadiens fans thought that ever since he had signed the short-term extension to stay in Montreal, which sees him making $1.9 million a year till the end of this season, a lot of people acknowledge that, hey, he played well at the end of his Canadian season in 22-23. If he's able to produce good numbers in 23-24, the Habs can very well trade him to another playoff contender and they could get some picks or whatever. That was always the plan that seemed to be in place here for many Canadiens fans viewing him as a player. This also is talked about in the opening paragraphs of this article, which will be linked in the description. Frank Seravalli goes out there and lists Canadiens center Sean Monahan, left-handed shot, 29 years old, 6'2", $1.85 million a year, etc., etc., and talks about how he is a middle six center and a crafty playmaker. After missing 74 games the last 2 seasons, Monahan has rebounded to become one of hockey's best comeback stories this year, and now a commodity ahead of the trade deadline. For maximum impact, Monahan will be playing with 2 high-end wingers and/or 1 elite shooter. If he drops to the third-line center role, he can easily fill in on a second-line late in games, even at the wing position. Now, the article goes over what makes Monahan good and how he's grown this season, but before we get into any of that, what I wanted to do was talk about the ending parts of Seravalli's piece, where he talks about potential suitors. He has a long freaking list of teams that could go out there and acquire Sean Monahan, but the Vancouver Canucks are indeed listed as one of them. They're on the prowl for a top 6 forward, but a complimentary center would make a ton of sense. It also talks about the Bruins, the Avalanche, the Oilers, Panthers, Rangers, Leafs, and Winnipeg Jets, so I mean, yeah, Seravalli doesn't really have too much of a localized idea as to where this is going to go. He's just tossing out names. But when it comes to the Vancouver Canucks, my favorite team, and the idea of them potentially acquiring a guy like Monahan, we've already talked about this over the past few videos, but there are growing rumors from different NHL sources, like Elliot Friedman, and I guess you could say like Frank Seravalli now, that say that the Vancouver Canucks could be in the market for a top 6 forward, or that they already are. We had talked about other names like Gensel, and we had talked about Lindholm. Those are the 2 guys that Friedman mentioned on his update on Saturday's Hockey Night in Canada broadcast. But the idea of Sean Monahan is a different one, to say the least. Mostly because, plain and simple, I don't think Sean Monahan is in that caliber of player that the Vancouver Canucks would be interested in. Now, of course, I follow the Canucks as well as the Habs. They're my 1 and 2 favorite teams, so I kind of come at this from a different perspective that sees both of them in spotlights in my mind. I want them both to exhibit success and do good moves that are beneficial to both parties. But when it comes to Monahan, I don't necessarily know if he fits the criteria of a guy whom the Canucks would be going after. Now, sure, you could say the point production is maybe in that realm. Monahan this season, 31 points, 46 games played, on pace for 56 over a full 82-game season. But when it comes to the way he plays, I mean, if the Vancouver Canucks were going to go out there and get a player like Monahan, if you wanted to thrust him into a top 6 role, you move SUITOR down to the 4th line and you have Monahan in on the 2nd line, or you swap around a Michkov or something, or a Kuzmenko, and you put Monahan in that 2nd line left wing spot. Even though he is a good enough player to maybe put in that position, Plain and simple, I just think some of the other guys that we have been talking about are more suited for those kinds of roles. Not that Monahan is not worth it, being a top 6 player on a Vancouver Canucks team, but even on the Montreal Canadiens now, he's the third-line center behind Evans and Suzuki. That's not necessarily an indictment against him, it's just the status of the team. What makes you think that Sean Monahan, who is a current third-line Canadiens guy, would be the best fit possible for a Canucks team who's a lot better than Montreal in their top 6? My point here is that when it comes to Vancouver, I feel like the other guys we talked about, like the Guentzel's and like the Lindholms, are just straight up better players, and there is a little bit more flexibility there that would make things more seamless to go after. Now sure, everybody we've talked about has been a rental. Guentzel expiring this season, Lindholm expiring this season, Monahan same thing. Monahan also has the cheapest contract out of these guys by half pretty much. It's a pretty significant margin. But Elias Lindholm is a former 40-goal, 82-point guy as far back as 2 seasons ago. Jake Guentzel is over a point per game and one of the top scorers on the Pittsburgh Penguins right now. Sean Monahan, while he is a fairly good player who's got good point production, and he is one of the top players on the Canadiens in points, I'd just straight up rather have a Lindholm or a Guentzel. Like, the price of what Monahan would go for would have to be so much lower than the asking price of those other guys for me to think about making that trade instead of a Guentzel or a Lindholm. And furthermore, if we're talking about the Vancouver Canucks as a team that should go all in, let's say they're in the first overall spot in the NHL, they're one of the top teams in goal percentages, let's say they have high-flying offensive players who are at the top of the NHL in points, and they've got a defenseman that is near the top of the NHL in D-man points, and a goalie who's tied for the league lead in shutouts, let's say they've got all that, which, spoiler alert, they do. This is a season more than any where the Vancouver Canucks should probably go all in. If you wanted to say there is a time to spare all your prospects and all your picks, this is that year, because you cannot really predict these things. So is it worth it to really go out there and buy low on what could be one of the best Vancouver Canucks seasons of all time? I forgot who it was that tweeted it out last night after the Canucks and the Blackhawks game, but the Canucks are on pace to having the best season this franchise has ever had. The amount of points they've got and the amount of games played supersedes that of the best seasons they've had in the past in 2010, 2011, 2012, etc. This Canucks team could be in a position to literally be changing history for the entire franchise. So, what incentive would there be to say, oh, Guentzel is costing this much and Monahan is costing that much? Let's just go for Monahan. And if you need a little bit more convincing, let's go out there and read what Saravalli writes in regards to Monahan and his game. Monahan earned the nickname Boring Sean Monahan in Calgary mostly through his personality in media interviews. His game won't earn him a spot in the highlight reels or in top 10s, as it's filled with little flash and dash, but his boring is the kind of reliable that coaches crave in the Stanley Cup Playoffs. Monahan combines his strong hockey IQ with work rate to put himself and his team at the best position on the ice to make plays. Even though the Canadiens' power play has been up and down, Monahan can act as a bumper position guy or act as a net front presence on a second unit. According to the NHL Edge system, Monahan is in the 95th percentile in high danger chances on goal this season. Defensively, Monahan's intelligence give him the ability to anticipate well and get a head start, which helps make up for a lack of foot speed in backchecking, properly angling the puck carriers, and supporting his defensemen. He is particularly strong inside the dots of his own end, ranking 13th in stick checks that have created loose pucks. Now, in regards to Elias Lindholm, it actually says this at the bottom: given the relative lack of talent that he's played with in Montreal, it's pretty remarkable that Monahan is actually on track to collect more points than former teammate Elias Lindholm, and is expected to be available at a lower price point by comparison. Why is that? The article then goes over how there are injury concerns and there is a lack of foot speed here with Monahan, and that he's not really that great of a shooter like he's been in the past. This is why a guy like Elias Lindholm would be seen as more valuable, just because he's a better shooter, he plays with more pace, and he's a lot closer to that prime season of 40 goals and 80 points than Monahan was. Last time Monahan had himself a point-per-game year or close to it, it was in 2018-19, before he went through all the injuries that he did, which slowed him down in the first place. Even though Monahan could be a very good complementary center, I don't think it would be in the Canucks' best interest to try to buy low. Go for whatever big fishes are out there. If Guentzel's available, I'd be down. With all the contract implications in place, I'd say like Guentzel for Kuzmenko, a first, and let's say Podkolzin, I really think about that. but paying like a first-round pick and another prospect for Monahan? I'm sorry, as much as I like the guy and what he's done for the Canadiens this season, I'd have to say no from the perspective of Patrick Allvin. What are your thoughts? If you agree with this, let me know in the comment section. If you disagree, let me know as well why that is. Canadiens and Habs fans, the floor is yours. I hope you enjoyed this video, and bye.